Okay, welcome everybody. If you don't mind putting your microphones on mute, I can hear myself in someone's microphone, which is creating an echo, and it makes me wonder if I'm sitting in an echo chamber. So I want to welcome everyone to our event tonight. It's an honor to have Cale Carter with us. Before we get started with the presentation, I have a little bit of preamble to go through. So if you'll just bear with me for one moment. All right, so we want to welcome you to tonight's virtual presentation, which is called The Legacy of the Buffalo Soldiers and Their Service in the 20th Century. I'm Christy Peliquin, the Development Manager for the Friends of the Texas Historical Commission. We're so glad you've joined us tonight, and we want to encourage you to get to know a little bit more about us. We are the nonprofit partner to the Texas Historical Commission. We provide support for preservation efforts across the state, and you can get to know a little bit more about us by checking out our What We Do page on our website at thcfriends.org. Let me go ahead and let in the rest of our audience. I'm flying solo tonight, so I just have me and myself and I to get through all the tech issues for tonight. So thank you for bearing with me. I also wanted to thank everyone who's made a donation through our virtual events. We're really grateful for all of those donations, and those donations go to support projects all across Texas. So thank you so much. Large and small, every donation matters. So thank you so much. I also want to acknowledge THC commissioners, Friends board members, as well as some of our colleagues at the Texas Historical Commission who are here with us tonight. We're always glad to see you and so happy that you could join. If you haven't already followed us on social media, we'd invite you to do so. We're on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn. And if you follow us, that's how you can learn about future events and programming, like our next virtual event coming up on October 26th, which is called Get Your Biscuits in the Oven, The Domestic Side of Life at Star Family Home State Historic Site. So please register for that event. We'd love to see you there. A few housekeeping items before I introduce today's speaker. We'd appreciate it if you could keep your microphones on mute. Again, that just helps us stay focused on our presenter. Tomorrow morning, I will be sending an email to everyone who registered for this event. And in that email, I will include a link to a recording of tonight's event. So if you want to share that with folks, please feel free. I will also include links or a list of resources or anything else that Cale might mention tonight that might be a resource that you want to follow up on your own. I'll include that in the email. And give me tomorrow morning, tomorrow afternoon to get that out, but be watching for that email. And I have to always say, watch your junk and spam folders, because sometimes the emails I send end up there. So if you don't hear from me, check that folder first, and then feel free to reach out to me if you don't get the email. So the run of show for tonight is that eventually I'm going to stop talking and welcome Cale Carter to present on his topic for tonight. While the presentation is going on, please feel free to put questions for Cale into the chat box. We'll get to as many of those as we can, as we have time for. This presentation ends at 7:30, so we'll get to as many questions as we can before 7:30. All right, let's get to the good stuff. It's now my privilege to introduce our presenter for this evening. Born in Columbia, South Carolina, Cale Carter always had a passion for history from an early age. This passion brought him to the Buffalo Soldiers National Museum to serve as a volunteer docent in 2008. Before that, he attended Lone Star College North Harris before transferring to Huston-Tillotson University, where he majored in history and minored in political science. While at Huston-Tillotson University, Cale was a fellow in the Mellon Mays Undergraduate Fellowship Program and conducted research in the French military archives on an Afro-French aviator who served in the French Air Force during World War II. In addition to being a Mello Foundation Fellow, Cale was also a fellow at the Institute for the Recruitment of Teachers. When not in class, Cale was an interpretive assistant with Texas State Parks and Wildlife in their Buffalo Soldiers Heritage and Outreach Program, where he worked as a living historian portraying the 25th Infantry Regiment on the Western frontier as well as World War II. After graduating summa cum laude with a BA in history, he returned to his home state where he worked with Columbia SC 63 a civil rights history organization, and the South Carolina Military Museum as curator of exhibitions. Currently, Cale is the director of exhibitions at the Buffalo Soldiers National Museum in Houston. Cale, it is an honor to have you with us tonight. I'm going to go ahead and let you come off mute and say hello. There we go.
Hey, y'all, how y'all doing?
Before I turn it over to Cale, I wanted to mention just one thing. I just found out that where I am located here in Austin, Texas, I am under a severe thunderstorm warning and a tornado watch. So if my connection bugs out for any reason, give me a moment. I will try to log back in. But I've already had the power flicker once, so I just wanted you all to be aware that that might happen. Cale, it's time for you to take it away. We're very excited to hear all that you have to tell us tonight.
Okay, so good evening, y'all. As mentioned before, my name is Cale Carter, and today my presentation will be focused on the legacy of the Buffalo Soldiers, which is going to based about the Black regular Army regiments in the 20th century. Just before I get started, the reason I kind of mentioned this topic was because when we talk about the Buffalo Soldiers, normally we talk about the Buffalo Soldiers primarily on the Western frontier and a little bit to the Spanish-American War. But one of the things that tends to happen is that once you get past the Spanish-American War, the stories or the investigations into the history kind of dies off. So hopefully with this presentation, we can actually at least hopefully encourage some engagement at least into understanding this topic and possibly some more research into this topic. So can the screen be seen? See, can the screen be seen? Okay, so
Yeah,
okay,
Cale,
good.
it looks great. You're in presentation mode and it looks great.
Okay, excellent. So before starting originally I thought it was gonna be interactive, so I was gonna hopefully ask some questions, but I'll just go through these and kind of give a brief summary of those questions. So the first one is, who are the Buffalo Soldiers? Normally when people refer to Buffalo Soldiers, they're referring to Black soldiers who served in the regular army between 1866 to 1898. So normally when people are referring to Buffalo Soldiers, they're talking about Black soldiers who was part of the 9th and 10th Cavalry and the 24th and 25th Infantry Regiments. How did they receive their name? The name was received from Native Americans on the Western frontier. Now, as to who, like which tribe specifically gave them the name, and as to why they were given a nickname, there's a few possible reasons out there. No one really knows for certain which specific tribe gave them the name or who gave them the nickname, but there are some speculated reasons. Some of the reasons connect to the fact that a lot of these soldiers had dark skin and dark eyes and naturally curly hair, and the Native Americans drew parallels to the color as well as the texture of the mane of the buffalo. Some say it had to do with the tenacious fighting spirit of the Black soldiers when they were in combat. With the buffalo, if it's wounded or cornered, they tend to fight ferociously, and some of that skills was kind of picked up with observing Black soldiers on the Western frontier when they fought. And then some will say it actually has to do with the buffalo hide coats that they wore, as well as the muskrat skin cap. So when some of the Native Americans first encountered these Black soldiers on the frontier, they're wearing buffalo hide coats, muskrat skin caps, and you combine that with, again, their dark skin and dark eye color, that led to possible drawing parallels to the buffalo out in the frontier. And the last question is, why are they known for their service on the frontier? Well, part of that is because, again, this is the first time that Black soldiers were allowed to serve in the regular army. Prior to this point, Black soldiers were allowed to volunteer during times of war, but this is the first time in American military history where Black soldiers were allowed to serve in the peacetime army and make a career out of serving in the military, as well as the significant roles they played on the frontier. So in addition to fighting the Native Americans and protecting the settlers as they moved westward, they also guarded railroads, built telegraph wires, built roads and stuff like that. So they were very critical in the essence of settling the West in terms of helping establish the infrastructure that was needed to help settle the Western frontier. So what we're going to do, we're going to go ahead and get started with the Buffalo Soldiers in the early 20th century. And of course, this portrait right here is pretty interesting. This is a portrait of soldiers and officers from Company I or India Company Now of the 24th Infantry Regiment, really at the turn of the century. So normally when we talk about soldiering in the military, we tend to think about fighting, doing a lot of shooting and stuff. But in the case of the Buffalo Soldiers in the early 1900s, one of the interesting things that they did was act as the precursors to the National Park Rangers that we see today. So when they first started creating these national parks, there was really no Department of the Interior that existed at the initial founding of the national parks. So the Army would have to step in and essentially serve as the prototype park ranger. So what were they doing in the national parks? They were preventing poachers from coming into national parks and stealing, or bandits hiding out there. And in addition, they would also combat forest fires. So in the case of the Buffalo Soldiers, there was a few regiments that participated in this. The 9th Cavalry, for example, under the command of, I forgot the name of the company, but it was under the command of Charles Young. They were actually based out at Sequoia out in California, basically protecting those national parks. And in the case of the photo right here, we had the 24th Infantry, which was conducting mounted patrols at Yosemite National Park. Now, one of the interesting things during this period that you have something that occurred called the Big Burn, which the Big Burn was a massive fire that took place in the Northwest in the early 1900s. And among the soldiers who helped combat that forest fire, that fire was the 25th Infantry Regiment. So in addition, they did see some military service and some military campaigns. So one of the earliest conflicts that the was involved in the early 20th century was actually a carryover from the 19th century, and that was the Philippine-American War. Philippine-American War actually started pretty much immediately after the Spanish-American War, when we went over and we basically tried to pacify a rebellion that was occurring there. Now, Buffalo Soldiers, they were sent there in rotation, so most of the regiments were rotated in and out of the Philippines during that time period. Also, as we started getting into the 1910s and really the pre-World War I era of the U.S., the Buffalo Soldiers also participated in the punitive expedition of 1916, where some of the regiments were assigned to basically guard on the border. Some of the regiments actually participated into the incursion into Mexico. And during World War I, the regiments themselves were not deployed overseas to Europe. One of the regiments was deployed overseas, but it didn't go to Europe. It went to Hawaii, and that was the 25th Infantry. They were based in Hawaii from, say, 1916, 1917, and then they were brought back to the United States right before World War I ended. But during this time period, during World War I, one of the interesting things that happened with the Buffalo Soldiers is that the 10th Cavalry Regiment participates in the last battle on the basic American frontier, and that's the Battle of Bear Valley in 1918. For those that don't know, the Battle of Bear Valley involved hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, but it was Yaqui Native Americans. They were basically going back and forth between Mexico and the southwestern United States, and the concern was that, of course, that they were smuggling firearms into the U.S. and stuff like that to support the Mexican Revolution. So there was concerns about that, and there was a skirmish that was fought between the 10th Cavalry and the units, but 10th Cavalry came out victorious. But again, it has the notation of being the final battle on the American frontier. And right here, I got an interesting video to show y'all guys. This is a video I actually came across while looking in the National Archives one day. So I know there's no sound for the video, so I'll do some quick explanation. So apparently this is footage of the 24th Infantry Regiment during the punitive expedition. And what is interesting is that normally during this time, there really isn't that much footage of Black soldiers. I want to say this is probably 1916. So prior to this, there wasn't nothing. The only known major footage we see is like Black soldiers in the Spanish-American War. But of course, they show like the Civil War and communicating via signals, kind of their living conditions in the field. I don't know how to mute that. Can I mute that? I don't know.
I'm sorry, Cale. It's when people enter the waiting room for the event.
Oh, okay, so I'm trying to say they don't know how to mute that part, but I'll just keep going.
Yeah.
right. So let's go to the next slide. So during this period, during the early 1900s, 1910s, there was a series of clashes between Buffalo soldiers and local Jim Crow laws. Most cases, it tended to be clashes between the black soldiers and law enforcement, primarily in Texas, but also in Arizona. So during this time period, you have the Brownsville Affair of 1906. The Brownsville Affair, of course, is when basically there was a massive shooting that occurred in Brownsville, Texas. Soldiers from the 25th Infantry Regiment were accused of participating, even though there was kind of conflicting evidence during the time, and even now it's pretty much understood that the soldiers did not actually participate in the shooting. They were accused because they were close at hand, they were in proximity, and as a result, this resulted in Teddy Roosevelt, who ironically served with some of the Buffalo soldiers in the Spanish-American War, basically dishonorably discharging an entire company of the 25th Infantry Regiment. And of course, it wasn't until I think the 1970s where they actually went back, reviewed the case, and overturned the dishonorable discharges to honorable discharges. The next major one, of course, is the Houston riots in 1917, or the Camp Logan mutiny. This occurred, of course, during the U.S. involvement in World War I. For those that don't know, the Houston riots, that basically starts when the 24th Infantry Regiment is brought to Houston, and there's a series of incidences that serve as clashes between the 24th Infantry Regiment and the local Houston Police Department. And ultimately, these clashes result in soldiers essentially marching into town and vowing to shoot anyone that looked like an HPD officer. Now, of course, this ends up being a case to where I forgot how many people were killed, but it was one of the few cases where during the riots or during a riot or violence where you saw more white people died than black people. But ultimately, it led to one of the largest court martials in the United States history at the time. 64 members of the unit were tried, and initially 13 were hung. But then they end up doing an executive review to try to basically verify the evidence in the case, and this ultimately led to a reduction in the number of people that was expected to hang in the second group. And the last one here is the Bisbee riot of 1919. Now, I'll be honest, I didn't really hear about the Bisbee riot until a few years ago. And with the Bisbee riot, this is actually during the red summer of 1919. So Bisbee, Arizona had a series of incidences involving both the local law enforcement and their population. But on July 4th, the 10th Cavalry was brought in to try to march in the Independence Day parade. And when they arrived, the local law enforcement took offense to the fact that the soldiers carried sidearms with them. They demanded they relinquish their sidearms. They refused. They went to Army commanders to try to tell them, hey, relieve their sidearms. But the Army commander said, well, they technically don't have to relieve them. And when the police officers tried to basically relieve the soldiers of their sidearms, this led to a firefight where some people got wounded, and I think one person got shot in the head, but they survived. And ultimately, this led to a situation to where after it happened, they went back and investigated. It was like, well, they couldn't really determine who was at fault of who really started, but it ultimately ended up being the case to where the 10th Cavalry Regiment didn't really have to face the same level of repercussions that the other two regiments did have to face. And so that takes us to the Buffalo Soldiers in the interwar period. And right here, you have Cavalrymen of Troop F, 10th Cavalry, basically doing review at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point during the interwar period. So normally the interwar period isn't really discussed as much, but there is some interesting things that happen for both the 9th and 10th Cavalry and the 24th and 25th Infantry Regiment. So, of course, during this time period, the 9th and 10th Cavalry, they were still stationed on the U.S.-Mexico border in the 1920s. In fact, they were stationed at a town, I want to say it was the 10th Cavalry, stationed at a town called Naco in Arizona. And part of the reason why they was moved there was to actually guard against a rebellion that was occurring in Mexico at the time. And there was concern that Mexican forces or Mexican revolutionaries would cross the border and basically do kind of a raid similar to what occurred that led to the Mexican punitive expedition. So what ended up happening was that they moved the units there almost as a display of force to say, hey, if you move into this area, you will be countered by U.S. forces, which in this case was 10th Cavalry, and I want to say it was one of the regiments, infantry regiments. In addition, during this time period too, they also trained cadets, well, the cadets at West Point on the finer skills of horsemanship, because at the time they were considered among the finest, had some of the finest horsemanship skills in the military at the time. So they were brought in to train cadets at West Point. And the last major thing that's pretty interesting is that during the 1930s and 1940s, like right to the build-up of World War II, the military was doing a series of maneuvers, both large-scale maneuvers and small-scale maneuvers. Both of the regiments participated in the cavalry maneuvers in Kansas in the 1930s, but their biggest maneuver they participated in prior to World War II was the big Louisiana maneuver in 1941. By that point, they was attached to the 2nd Cavalry Division, and they actually was using they basically still using horses, and they were basically doing problem exercises going against mechanized units and other units as well. So with the 24th and 25th Infantry Regiments during the interwar period, some of the units did see similar service on the border as well. The 24th Infantry Regiment at the start of the interwar period actually was brought in to serve as guard forces against the coal miner strikes that was occurring in New Mexico in 1919, 1920. But shortly after that, they were moved to Fort Benning, Georgia to serve as infantry school troops. Now, also during the interwar period, particularly in the 1930s, both the 24th and 25th Infantry Regiment served as support units for the Civilian Conservation Corps in various areas. So in the case of the 24th Infantry, they served as a support unit for the Civilian Conservation Corps in Georgia. And in the case of the 25th Infantry Regiment, they served as a support unit initially in the southern Arizona district, but then later the entirety of Arizona. And also for a short time, some subsect was broken off for a year to serve as the support unit for a Civilian Conservation Corps group in Tyler, Texas. So, and I think it was specifically the colonel of the 25th and a few other soldiers. So, but I found that interesting. But the last thing I'll point out too is the Carolina maneuvers of 1941. So in addition to the Louisiana maneuvers, there was a series of major maneuvers that took place prior to U.S. involvement in World War II. The Louisiana one is the more well-known and famous one, but you also had the Tennessee maneuvers, the Arkansas maneuvers, and the last one was the Carolina maneuvers that took place in October, November 1941. And of course, because the 24th Infantry Regiment was based in Georgia, they also served in the maneuvers as well, basically. And this takes us to the units in World War II. Now, personally, I found this photo interesting because I came across this actually in one of my usual lengthy searches through the National Archives. And this is probably one of the few times I've actually seen reference of the 9th Cavalry deploying overseas during World War II. So this is basically with them and the Red Cross nurse at the Hampton Roads port of embarkation. So when you talk about the 9th and 10th Cavalry Regiments in World War II, overall, they spent most of their time, since they were among the most experienced regiments in the regular army, alongside the 24th and 25th Infantry Regiments. They were used to help build up other Black combat and service units. So what they would do, they would take the senior NCOs and other experienced soldiers from the 9th and 10th Cavalry and the 24th and 25th Infantry, and they would transfer them to other units to help build up the staff cadre. So you had cases where 9th Cavalry guys were in tank. Some of them were tank destroyer battalions and tank battalions. Some guys were transferred to infantry, and some guys even transferred to artillery and other regiments that were being built. Now, of course, during this period too, both regiments were attached to the 2nd Cavalry Division. Specifically, that was part of the 4th Cavalry Brigade, 2nd Cavalry Division. And what made the 2nd Cavalry Division unique is that when the war first started, it was technically an integrated division. So you had the 3rd Cavalry Brigade, which was an all-white cavalry brigade, but then you had the 4th Cavalry Brigade, which was all-black. Well, basically consisted of Black regiments. And then shortly after, they demobilized, they deactivated the 2nd Cavalry Division, but then they brought them back as an all-Black cavalry division. And it basically made it the third and final Black combat division formed in World War II. And also, in order to build that division, they also used, again, a 9th and 10th Cavalry to help build it. During World War II, the 10th Cavalry had some of their soldiers participated in the Battle of the Hauser Creek Fire in the Cleveland National Forest in October 1943. initially it was brought in to basically, it was initially Marines that was brought in, but they also brought in personnel from Camp Lockett, California, which consisted of the 10th Cavalry to battle the fire, and they actually lost a trooper to the fire. I forgot his rank, but his last name was Carter, and he basically died. It was a smoke inhalation. And together with the 2nd Cavalry Division, the 9th and 10th Cavalry, they were deployed to North Africa and essentially broke into service units. Prior to them being deployed, there was a lot of concern about, hey, you have these black combat units. They're spending a lot of time stateside training, but they're not deploying overseas for combat. And there was a lot of pressure from the black newspaper saying that, hey, all these commanders are requesting need for troops. Here's an entire division of troops. Why you're not using them? So Army Command was like, okay, well, there's really no need for horses. What are our options with the 2nd Cavalry Division? Well, the option at the time, they said, well, we really do need service units in both North Africa and Europe. We really need service units to help support these forces who are going in. So the idea was that, okay, well, we'll move the 2nd Cavalry Division to North Africa, and once they are away from the States, we will go ahead and convert them into service units. And so pretty much when they arrive in North Africa, March 1944, this essentially marks the end of the 9th and 10th Cavalry as segregated units, because once they arrive in North Africa, they're converted into port battalions and basically port battalions and other support units. Now, with the 24th and 25th Infantry Regiment, they fared a little bit better in the sense that they were actually deployed overseas and they actually did see combat and service. So the 24th Infantry Regiment actually was among the first black units to be deployed overseas. So normally in the early stages of World War II, most of the black units that were deployed overseas were mostly service units. So like engineering regiments, port companies, port battalions. But the 24th Infantry was among the few black combat units to be deployed overseas in the early stages of World War II. So they were deployed early in I think they were deployed specifically in April 1942, and they went to the South Pacific almost immediately, kind of serving in guard details, helping basically helping offload ships and build fortifications and stuff like that. But then they were brought to Bougainville, New Guinea in early 1944, shortly after the Japanese counteroffensive in February, March, and they were brought on to basically serve in a combat role, basically kind of going out trying to root out the last of the Japanese resistance on the island. The 25th Infantry Regiment is basically used to help build up the 93rd Infantry Division. So in World War II, when war is basically activated, the first black combat division to be raised is the 93rd Infantry Division. They were raised in May 1942. And they were essentially built around the 25th Infantry Regiment, because the 25th Infantry Regiment at the time was at Fort Huachuca. And again, it was a very experienced unit. So they simply took soldiers that were experienced from that regiment to basically build up the staff of the other units, both the combat and the support units that were a part of the division. And with the rest of the 93rd Infantry Division, the 25th Infantry Regiment spent most of its time training stateside, trained in Arizona, trained in Louisiana, and trained in California. And then in early 1944, they were deployed to the Pacific Theater, initially Guadalcanal, but then they were also deployed to Bougainville, where they first saw combat, and around Easter 1944, so April 1944. And by the war's end, the 24th and 25th Infantry Regiment, they were still in the Pacific Theater. The 24th was stationed in Okinawa, and they had to oversee the surrendering of a garrison of Japanese troops there. And the 25th Infantry Regiment, along with the 93rd, they were based in Morotai, which was the Dutch East Indies at the time, but it's now known as Indonesia. Now, what is interesting during this period is that the 25th Infantry Regiment during the World War II, they have some of the distinction of being one of the earliest black combat units to see combat, but then also before the war ended, they actually have the distinction of capturing the highest ranked Japanese officer alive. So normally, when it comes to Japanese officers in World War II, normally the policy was death before surrender. Basically, if there was on the losing end of a battle or the battle was about to be lost, it was basically preferred they would commit suicide. Well, in the case of the 25th, they actually managed to capture a Colonel Uichi, who was in command of the 211th Regiment of the 32nd Imperial Japanese Army Division. They managed to capture him alive, and from the records I've read, it's kind of conflicted on the backstory, but some records say that he was captured while he was kind of wandering about, and he thought he was safe, and some soldiers from the 25th got the jump on him, and they basically managed to capture him alive. But they captured him literally right before the surrender of the Japanese forces. So they have a distinction of being one of the few units to capture a high-ranking Japanese officer alive prior to the end of World War II. And another video I found from the National Archives that's pretty interesting. Let me see if I can try to play this and put this.
Our cameraman went into action again, this time with the American colored troops. For 5 miles, they've been on the heels of a bunch of retreating Japs. Now they've cornered them across the La Ruma River. They get into position to watch the far bank closely. An American officer, Captain Eddy, has crossed the river and single-handed is working along the bank, clearing the Japs out of pillboxes with hand grenades. Watch closely on the right, and in a moment you'll see him signal. He's waving now. It's his signal for the rest to come on over. While some cross the river, others keep them covered. These boys have learned well the tricks of jungle fighting.
All right, so a little bit of backstory on that before I move to the next. Well, while I move to the next slide. So this action was filmed by a New Zealand film crew.
Our cameraman went into action again.
That was filmed by a New Zealand film crew in Bougainville around Easter weekend 1944. They basically wanted to record some of the soldiers in that action, and there's a larger video I can send out later if y'all want to see that. But and here we get to the basically towards the ending of the presentation, the legacy of the Buffalo Soldiers and integration and beyond. And of course, with this photo, we're talking about the soldiers of the 24th Infantry Regiment, which by this point is pretty much the last of the original Buffalo Soldiers serving in the Korean War. So after World War II, the regiments are still in service. The 24th Infantry Regiment, again, is in Okinawa, and the 25th is in the Pacific Theater as well. But when you get to 1946, the 25th Infantry Regiment was initially deactivated along with the rest of the 93rd Infantry Division, but then it was brought back less than a few months later as a regimental combat team and did mostly training stateside. And then from there, the regiment was broken up into battalions. And this is where we get to around the time that Executive Order 9981 was issued. So with Executive Order 9981, the order was to integrate the military. However, the military at that time still had over 250 segregated Black units. And of course, it really wouldn't be until the Korean War where a lot of these units will be integrated primarily through necessity rather than anything else. So the 24th, 25th remain segregated. Now, when it comes to this period, during this time period, the 24th Infantry Regiment, they were pretty much based in Japan. Specifically, documents mention that they were based in Gifu, Japan during this time period, I think 1948, 1949, right before the Korean War broke out. Now, as I mentioned before, the 25th Infantry Regiment was broken up into battalions. One of the battalions, which became the 25th Infantry Battalion, was retained stateside and was specifically in Washington State to basically serve as a training unit, basically a separate training unit for Black soldiers coming into the 2nd Infantry Division for a short time. But you also had the other battalions, which became the 94th and 95th Infantry Battalions. They were based in Japan around 1948 and for a short time, and specifically around the same area as Gifu. So they also served as kind of a training regiment and a replacement unit for the 24th to draw replacements from. So pretty much after the Korean War, when the Korean War ends, that's when the military is pretty much on the finishing process of integration. During the Korean War, the 24th Infantry Regiment was disbanded. They were specifically disbanded in 1951, which marks them of the kind of the ending of the last of the original segregated Buffalo Soldier regiments. Now, with that being said, around the same time that the unit was disbanded, the 9th and 10th Cavalry regiments' legacies will be carried on initially by tank battalions. So the 9th and 10th Cavalry's lineage was carried on initially through the 509th and the 510th tank battalions, which I want to say one of them was based in Europe for a short time. But by this point, by the time they were reactivated, they was reactivated as integrated units. Now, right before the Vietnam War breaks out, that's when they revert the lineage goes from the 509th and the 510th tank battalions to the 9th and 10th Cavalry, with the 9th Cavalry being part of the first, I think it was the first brigade of the 9th Cavalry, which served with the 1st Air Cavalry Division in Vietnam. The 10th Cavalry Regiment served as a mechanized unit in Vietnam. I think it was a medium tank battalion, so they had M48 patents. And the 24th Infantry Regiment, they get reactivated shortly after the first Gulf War in, I think it was 1992, 1993. And pretty much since then, they were pretty much integrated into as an organic component of the 25th Infantry Division, the same infantry division that served with in the Korean War. And of course, these units will basically go on to see service pretty much not only through the Vietnam War, but pretty much through the global war on terror. And even today, the first, I think the 9th Cavalry, I want to say the 10th Cavalry for a time was based at Fort Hood, and the 24th has went between Washington State and Alaska. And so we reached the end of my presentation. These are some of the sources I use in the presentation, and some of the books I use as well. And then this is the other side of the sources as well, like some of the books I've written. There's probably, as I mentioned earlier on, there's probably some more books out there. Like if y'all have any questions, feel free to ask, and I'll be more than happy to provide them. And yeah, we're pretty much at the end of this. So
Yes,
yeah.
so definitely do visit the Buffalo Soldiers Museum there in Houston, where Cale is director of exhibitions as well. Definitely want to promote the museum and promote visitation, and for folks to hopefully be interested in this topic enough to keep learning. Right? This is a topic we could have probably gone on all night. Cale is an encyclopedia of knowledge on this topic, and it's wonderful to hear you speak. So thank you so much. We're so grateful for that. We did have a couple questions. So if you don't mind, we will pick your brain about a couple things. Let me get to the top of my questions list here. So Val was asking, were the soldiers allowed equipment equal to the white soldiers?
Yeah, so, and this is kind of funny really, because this is, I know I'm probably long-winded, but this is one of the funny things that comes up. So there was a debate, and there's like this common notion that when it came to the black soldiers, they received lesser equipment. And in reality, the answer is very complex. So when you talk about the Buffalo Soldier regiments, both on the frontier and even as late as World War II in Korea, you hear reports that, oh, these guys were issued like secondhand equipment. They were the equipment that was basically in bad shape and shoddy and stuff like that. Now, in reality, there was some truth to it, but there was some other context that's left out of it. And that context was the fact that after a major war ends, especially when they have the period of transition between the ending of a war and the next fiscal budgets, the military is, if anybody that's in the military or been in the military, they know the military is cheap. The military will try to reuse stuff and just keep it going. So in the case, like in the 24th Infantry Regiment, for example, in Japan, there's reports saying, oh, these guys received equipment in bad shape, like old M1 Garens that was in the Pacific Theater and older equipment. And it wasn't just the 24th Infantry, it was other regiments as well that received it, because the Army being like, okay, well, the war is over. We just spent a bunch of money. We're essentially not going to spend any more money until we get basically more funding. So basically use what you got. Now, with that being stated, where I speculate that some of this comes up is when we talk about World War I. Now I'm going a little bit off topic from Buffalo Soldiers back, but it's going to connect over, trust me. So during World War I, a lot of the black soldiers who were deployed to France were in support units. And while the combat units did receive combat equipment, the support units, because they were essentially raised so rapidly, a lot of the soldiers would go over in uniforms that were not modern. So like, in fact, I'm gonna try to find this. I wish I could try to find this footage and actually show it if possible. There's footage where you see these soldiers on a transport ship heading over to France, and if you get the soldiers, the black soldiers that's on the deck, some of them are wearing like the standard M19, I think it was the M1910 pattern uniform, and some are wearing the M1917 pattern. But you got some that's wearing a mix of like dungaree trousers and the old dress coat from 1903. And so because a lot of those units were raised so rapidly, like, okay, well, we need you guys to go over there and do support duties to basically help offload the ships. We're going to give you what we got. And then once we get the stocks, and we'll slowly think. Because again, priority during wartime goes to combat units. And with support units, like, okay, you get whatever that's left over because one, we're not expecting you to see combat. So, but to have a short answer, it's a complex answer. When it comes to the Buffalo Soldiers, in most cases, they were issued the same equipment that other soldiers would have been issued at the time, which again depends on if it's after a war or during wartime. But when it comes to, I say overall, it's a very nuanced question. But wait, did I answer the question? I know I'm kind of rambling a little bit.
You did a great job. Yes, it sounded like the thing that you were getting at is that this is complex and that there's not a one blanket answer that covers the whole picture.
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so Lily is asking, what is the first year for Black cadets admitted to West Point?
So in terms of the first year admissions, some of those admissions, now, again, I could be wrong. So again, I apologize in advance if I don't get this right. But I want to say, at least from the things I've read, some guys was being admitted as early as immediately after the Civil War. So I want to say, I know there was one person that was admitted from South Carolina that was in the first group of Black cadets. I forgot his name, but I want to say, ironically, I think Samuel L. Jackson participated in a movie that was about him. But it was a trial. It was a trial of cadets. Something I forgot the movie, but he was among the first groups admitted. He was one of the first Black soldiers to be admitted, but he wasn't able to complete because, again, of the sheer amount of prejudice and racism that he faced while there. So, but of course, when we talk about the first one that actually completed, that's when we talk about Henry O'Slide Flipper, and that's in 1877. Yeah, 1877. But when you talk about the first Blacks to be admitted to West Point, you're talking about pretty much immediately after the Civil War, like the time period after the Civil War.
Thanks, Cale. Val is also asking, is the Buffalo Soldier Museum still in operation in San Angelo, Texas? Do you know?
I'll probably be able to speak on that because are they talking about Fort Concho?
I'm not sure. Val, do you want to come off mute and ask your question?
Right. Is it still in operation?
Now, I know it's been a minute since I was basically with TPWD, so I would like to say they are, but again, sadly, I'm not able to answer that question effectively. Well, First Sergeant Warren, I'm sorry to call you out, but he says yes, so I'm gonna take his word for it. He's more in the field than I am. So, shout out to First Sergeant Warren. How you doing?
Great, thanks, guys.
Thank you. And to everyone, I'm so sorry if you can hear thunder in the background. It's loud here right now. All right, our next question is, for folks who are asking about future events and a recording of this presentation and a link to Cale's email address and other things, I will send all of that out to everyone who registered for this event in an email sometime tomorrow. So just watch your inboxes for all of that. Let's see. Sean is asking, were there any other Black soldier units besides these 4?
Oh yes, there was a lot of them. Like, so when you talk about, like, pretty much during the same time you have the Buffalo Soldiers in the frontier, there's actually, and this is, got to shout out another person. He's not on the thing right now, but there's a gentleman named Darren Overby. He's a USCT reenactor. I was talking to him one day, and he actually mentioned that pretty much when they started the first Buffalo Soldier regiments, they were actually United States colored troop regiments that were not only in Texas, but there was one as far west as New Mexico around the same time they started the Buffalo Soldiers. And then after those units were demobilized and deactivated, in terms of in the military, on the regular military, you didn't have any, but in terms of state militias, you did have Black state militias. I think Texas had a few of them spread out throughout Houston. I think it was Houston, Austin, San Antonio, and Dallas. But when you get to around the Spanish-American War, that's where you start seeing those Black state militias that did survive the Reconstruction period, like primarily up in the upper Midwest and the Northeast, being converted into the early National Guard units. So, like, while we talked the 24th, the 9th and 10th Cavalry, 24th and 25th Infantry Regiments as the regular army, you also had Black National Guard units that were coming into fruition around this time. So you had the 8th Illinois, which later became the 370th Infantry Regiment during World War I. You had the 369th Infantry Regiment, which of course was originally the 15th New York Guard. And then you had the 372nd, which comprised the Black National Guard units from basically, I think it was Massachusetts, Washington, D.C., and a few other areas. And then also coming from New Jersey as well. So to keep it short and not going a long tangent, yes, there were other Black units, but the other Black units you tend to see, especially in the 20th century, they tend to be National Guard and also reserve units. In the case of reserve units, there were three. There was the 447th, the 449th, and the 428th. They were reserve units that would serve as training units for both the civilian military training. There was a civilian military training corps for Black soldiers that wanted to train people that wanted to train in the military, but then you also had the Black ROTC units from the HBCUs like Howard, Tuskegee, and stuff like that. So a lot of the guys from Howard would train with the 428th Infantry Regiment that was in the reserves, and the guys from Tuskegee would train with the 447th, which was part of the reserve. So again, just to simplify, apart from those four regiments, you did have Black Reserve and Black National Guard units. But with the 9th and 10th Cavalry, 24th and 25th Infantry, they're part of the regular army, meaning that, like with the National Guard, they train, but they're called up when there's a national emergency. Same thing with the reserve units.
So I think this is the same person who just asked the question that you just answered. This time the question is units that stayed intact throughout. So I think he's asking were there units that stayed intact throughout, and which ones?
So
I hope I'm asking that right.
I get what you're saying. Was there any units that basically stayed active pretty much after a certain time and haven't really broken, weren't deactivated or reactivated or something like that? Or
yeah, Sean, do you want to come off mute and ask your question? You could probably phrase it better than I. He's around.
Oh, he'd say he can't come off mute, sadly.
Oh, that's okay. Well, yeah, I think that was his question. Were there units that stayed intact?
So in terms of Black units that stayed intact, the only one that comes to mind almost immediately off the jump was a unit that was called the 758th Tank Battalion. So what's interesting, 758th Tank Battalion was actually the first Black tank battalion raised. They were initially called the 78th Tank Battalion, but then they were converted into the 758th Tank Battalion. And then it was attached to the 5th Armored Group, which comprised of the more famous and more well-known 761st Tank Battalion and the 784th. But after World War II, elements of the unit do survive, and the 758th really survives all the way up as the 758th until about 1948, 1949. But then they're changed from the 758th to the 64th Tank Battalion. And what is interesting is that when they deployed to Korea, I think they deployed part of the 3rd Infantry Division, or either 3rd Infantry, I forget which one they deployed part of, but they were initially a segregated Black tank battalion, and they was crewing, I think it was M46 Pattons. And again, like I said, this is why I wish I could just show y'all videos, because I literally found videos of the 64th Armored in Korea, basically like crewing tanks and everything else. But then when they, like during the war, they become integrated, and essentially from that point forward, they serve as the 64th Armored. I think it was the first 64th Armored Regiment and then the 64th Armored Battalion. So the lineage of that unit still carries on today, but originally it was a Black Tank Battalion that was initially the 758th. And I'm probably forgetting some other units, but I know some engineering regiments that were initially regiments but downgraded to battalions. They survived through the war, and they're still around today. I think it was the 91st and the 92nd. But there's a few other units I'm probably thinking of, but that probably could be found out there. But the one that comes to mind immediately that kind of survived as a unit that just kind of really wasn't fully demobilized or deactivated was the 758th, returned to the 64th Armored.
Thank you, Cale. Okay, so Ruth is asking, were there any differences in the post-World War I and World War II benefits given to Buffalo Soldier units and white units?
No. So in the case of World War One, pretty much, and this actually calls into an interesting subject matter too. So during World War One, federal benefits were again supposed to come directly from the federal government. So that meant that basically, as long as you qualified, you were supposed to receive those benefits. And in fact, those receival of benefits actually caused some contention in the South. So in the case of South Carolina and Louisiana, there was actually newspaper articles written where you have local government officials basically telling Black women, hey, you need to go back to work. And the reason they're like, well, why are you telling Black women to go to work? Well, the reason why was because the soldiers who were overseas, as well as the soldiers who was able to receive pensions, they were telling their wives, like, hey, you don't have to work no more. Like, take this money that we're getting, put it towards some land, put it towards a house, like, so we don't have to basically work for these pennies and stuff like that. But it literally upset the balance of some of these smaller southern towns to the point they're like, hey, we got to do something about this. This is causing chaos. Now, when you get to, and this actually plays a role into how the World War II GI Bill gets kind of implemented too. So right after, I think right around the time they started actually drafting the legislation for the GI Bill, you had a lot of Southern politicians saying, hey, we recall the stories of World War One where Black veterans who were able to get benefits were able to get benefits, and this kind of upset the way of life for things down here. So they really advocated for the, oh, I'm sorry, probably causing things to rock a little bit, but they were advocating for direct control. And by direct control, I mean, like, even though the GI Bill was to be implemented through a federal policy, that the states would have more direct control over certain aspects of it. And in the South, a lot of Southern politicians are saying, hey, we need to have more control of it because we see what happened in World War One, and we kind of want to keep things on a certain level. So as a result, when you get to World War II, the benefits still do go out, but there's a little bit more restrictions in certain areas in terms of accessing them, or not even accessing them, being able to implement them in certain areas. So like in the South, you got an honorable discharge. You may have a GI Bill, you may have access to a low interest home loan, but where you can go get a house at? Well, you're only restricted to certain areas. Same thing with education. When it came to education, you may get a GI Bill, but where can you go to apply that education? Well, in the case of some of the Southern areas, like if you were lucky, there was an HBC you can go to, but in other areas, it kind of restricted. So there was a slight difference, but again, the way that benefits were implemented during World War One kind of impacted, especially in the South, how they will be implemented in World War II.
Thank you. That was wonderful. Okay. Billy Wilson is asking, who were the leaders of the units? And he says Charles Smith.
Charles Young.
He says Charles Smith in the comment, but.
So.
I'm sorry, I meant Charles Young.
Oh, okay. Thank you for coming off mute and asking that.
All right. So when you talk about the Buffalo Soldiers, early on, most of the units were commanded by white officers. Now, when you start seeing the first Black officers from West Point, like Henry O. Flipper, I'm going to say Henry O. Flipper, I think, was a commissary officer initially. But then you get John Alexander, who was the second graduate from West Point. He's made an officer, but I had to do some more research to see if he was actually put in a command position like Charles Young. But in the case of Charles Young was pretty much put in command position. I want to say that, in fact, there was a book at the museum that if you ask about, we can give you like kind of access to the copies of, where he was initially a troop commander. Then he works his way up to, I want to say it was not battalion. I think it was either battalion. I forgot. It might have been battalion, but he works his way from troop commander battalion, and he works his way up the ranks until basically we get to around World War One, where the contingent kind of comes in to basically making him general. Now, when you fast forward to World War II, you do see Black units with entirely Black command staffs, but the Buffalo Soldiers, sadly, is not among them. So in the case of the Buffalo Soldiers, you do see Black platoon commanders, or you see Black platoon commanders, and you even see a few Black troop commanders. But like once you get to a certain point, you don't really see like, okay, like a Black officer commanding the entire regiment. Now, I said, with that said, you do kind of see that with some of the the units raised in World War II, and even some of the Black National Guard units, and even in World War I, there was a case where I want to say the 370th, I think, had a Black officer as a commander and stuff. So, but when you get to like World War II, I know it's off the top of my head, there's a few all Black commanded units. You got the 366, which is commanded by Colonel Queen. I think his name was Howard Donovan Queen. You got the 6th AAA Central Postal Battalion that was commanded by Charity Adams. You got the 597th Field Artillery Battalion and the 600th Field Artillery Battalion that was commanded by Black officers. But to keep it short and get to the answer, you did have a few Black commissioned officers here or there that might have risen up the ranks and reached a certain command level, but you don't really see a case where you have a Black officer literally being the commander of the entire 9th Cavalry or the entire 10th Cavalry, something like
that. I apologize if you all saw me jump just then. The lightning struck very close to my window, so I apologize for being distracting, but it scared me. All right, so back to our questions. Sean has a couple more. One of them, Sean, the question you're asking about getting material for display at your museum, that might be a question that would be better asked through an email to Cale. So I'm going to skip to your second question. And the second question is, in the Pacific Theater, was the 25th assigned to any carrier groups?
No. So in the 25th Infantry Regiment, when they were deployed to the Pacific Theater, part of the reason why the 25th Infantry Regiment and the 93rd Infantry Division were deployed to the Pacific Theater in the first place was primarily to free up white combat divisions that were in kind of slugging around Bougainville for the invasion of the Philippines. Like, in fact, there was a whole contentious period, I want to say, between the Louisiana maneuvers they did in the summer of 43 to their deployment in 44 about commanders kind of juggling, okay, what do we do with this unit? Because the Black press was saying, hey, we deploy this unit overseas. People saying they need troops. And people are like, oh, well, we need troops, but we don't really want them, or we don't really have a way to apply them in X, Y, and Z. So as a result, when the 25th Infantry Regiment and the 93rd Infantry Division are deployed to the Pacific, the commander of the, I forgot which, I can't remember if it was a corps commander or theater commander, but he basically says, okay, well, we will take the 93rd and we'll take the 25th Infantry as long as they can free up a seasoned division to participate in the invasion of the Philippines that were upcoming. But when it comes to being attached to carrier groups, no, they weren't. Now, I did find a record of them being transferred from Tulagi and Guadalcanal to Bougainville on a destroyer, but they were not attached to a carrier group. The only people that would have been attached to a carrier group would have been Marines. And when it came to kind of the Army Marine structure and Army Navy Marine Corps structure in the Pacific, the Army and the Army Air Force were kind of kept to their own thing, especially after the Marines was a secure area. And, well, to a degree, because Army would land on beaches and actually come like Aguilar and 44 and also Guadalcanal and stuff like that. But normally the Army strategy was like, okay, we're all focusing on our core goal is the Philippines. Whereas the Navy Marine Corps team like, okay, we're going to island hop till we get to as close to Japan as possible. But no, the 25th Infantry was not attached to a carrier group, sadly.
Thank you, Cale. Mr. English, I'm going to invite you to come off mute and ask your question to Cale. If you're able to, if you want to.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Hi, Cale, I heard that you're from Columbia, South Carolina. And my dad family's from there, and I'm first texting here. I'm a little concerned because he was about 40 when he had me, and his parents had died before the 1930 census in Richland County. And I could understand how I read some of the documents of him being in the military, World War II, joining at 17, but I don't understand how he was a medic when Blacks were, I assume, were in the kitchen and so forth. So I'm interested in knowing how difficult it was for being a Buffalo soldier and then also having a civilian life during the times of segregation and all that was happening in America.
Okay, so it's like a multi-faceted question. The first one is about like basically the roles outside of like the typical roles, but then also kind of seeing how soldiers serve, like how the soldiers kind of navigate serving in the military and not serving and being in segregated America, correct, sir?
Yes, correct.
Okay, so first things first, I'm glad to see someone else from South Carolina here, because like originally to be actually clear, I say Columbia because most people don't really know of this small town. I'm originally from a small town called Hopkins, South Carolina, which is in southeastern Richland County. When it comes to your father's service, if you know his name, there is the military museum I worked at. They did have access to some records that show kind of the enlistment records of people that were from South Carolina that was in the military. So if he served in the military in World War II, they should have his name and stuff. And if not, like send me his information. I can look him up and try to help research. To answer the second part about him being a medic, what is interesting is that, and this goes back to kind of again the depiction we tend to have of Black soldiers in the military. One of the things we tend to talk a lot about is that how we talk about Black soldiers serving in the military as primarily service and support troops. And vast majority of Black soldiers that did serve in both World War I and World War II were support troops. But two things about that. One, in those support units, you did have to have, like, because especially in the case of like engineering regiments, they were essentially self-contained. So you did have like trained medical personnel, stuff like that. And even with combat, you had to have medics as well. So like pretty much if he's a medic, he could have been a part of a combat unit. He could have been actually part of a ambulance unit, which actually that would make his history even more interesting, because one of the things that we don't really hear about is kind of the medical battalions and the people that was attached to medical, Black soldiers attached to medical units during the war. When it comes to the final part about how Black soldiers navigated serving in the military and dealing with segregation and then dealing with segregation outside the military, honestly, serving in the military sometimes like it's the best way to describe it is like, I forgot how to describe it, but it was a video, not a video, I think it was something I did a while back where I was explaining how like normally Black soldiers who would join the military would join, especially during times of war, or be inducted to the military, would join or be inducted with the premise that, hey, if you fight for this country, you will gain the fruits of citizenship. And oftentimes what would happen is that when those soldiers would come home, and especially in the Deep South, and experience the indignity of the Jim Crow South and racism, it's like they joined and they fought and bled and died for the fruits of citizenship, only to be denied that when they came home. Now, in some cases, this leads to like different things. So like in the case, like one of the things that's kind of interesting, and I know I'm probably kind of much about it, but one of the interesting things about it, and this is something I think I mentioned to one of my friends who was having a conversation about this, when you look at the correlation between Black advocacy and major wars, you see there's a correlation oftentimes like after a major conflict, especially like the Civil War, World War I, World War II, and to a lesser degree, Korea and Vietnam. You see where you have soldiers, Black soldiers in particular, who are basically told, okay, you're fighting to preserve democracy. You're fighting to preserve these citizenships, the fruits of citizenship. They go off, they fight, they sacrifice, and then they come home and they're denied it. So that oftentimes spur a lot of the Black veterans, as well as other people within the Black community, to say, hey, we need to start advocating, like we're owed certain rights as citizens. And not only that we owed it, we basically make the ultimate sacrifice for them. So like in the Civil War, this manifests in what you see in the Reconstruction period. In World War I, this manifests partly in the rest of them, but also the Harlem Renaissance and the advocacy that comes after. And like some of that basically through political and stuff like that. And in the case of World War II, that manifests in the civil rights movement. Now, with that being stated, sometimes while that's the positive impact, you also had kind of the negative impact where it led to kind of a sense of cynicism about it. So kind of bringing it to a personal level, like my uncle Leon, which sadly he's not on here, but Uncle Leon, he's a Vietnam War veteran, but he grew up around a lot of World War II veterans in South Carolina. And I remember one of the stories he told me about like how when he was a kid, how he would watch war movies. And then when he thought about joining the military, they actively said, don't join the military. Like, you don't want to do it. And partly it's like, he asked them why. It's like, he said, well, part of it was the fact of what they experienced overseas, but then the fact that, hey, I fought for this country and then I come home and in my immediate community, I may have a semblance of like freedom and stuff. But when it goes to the larger thing, even though I'm too a war veteran, I may not get the same level of respect or treatment that other war veterans may receive. And so, and in fact, I was going to make a reference to one of my favorite movies, but like that's part of why I think that even the soldier store, but that's more so on the military side. But yeah, but I hope I answered your question. I know it kind of went on a lengthy ramble, but
I'm grateful that you asked that question, because I think that question kind of ties into a whole bunch of other cultural, cultural tidbits that we haven't covered when we're just talking about the military service. This gets into more complex issues, and I'm glad that you asked that question, Mr. English. And Cale, thank you for that detailed answer. I am in awe of how much you know about this subject. It's truly humbling. Let me see. There's a comment in the chat about that there will be another presentation about the Buffalo Soldiers by a Baylor University professor. So thank you for whoever posted that in the chat. That sounds very interesting. And I want to let you know, Cale, I know you haven't had time to scroll through the chat, but there is such a large amount of gratitude for this presentation. And I just, I know that this is an important presentation for you to do, and we're grateful. So thank you. Let's see. The next question is it true that the initial GI Bill did not include benefits for Black soldiers?
now that's something not to do some more research into. I've heard actually that it was supposed to include Black soldiers, but then it got taken away. But from the research I've done up to this point, as long as you had an honorable discharge, it was supposed to apply to you. Now, as I mentioned before, the use of it, the ability to be able to use it, that's where it came into contention, particularly in the South. Now, with that being stated, there was a way to deny access to the GI Bill early on, and that was either through blue discharge, which was basically kind of an other than honorable discharge, or dishonorable discharge. And normally when you receive a dishonorable discharge or other than honorable discharge, it normally, dishonorable discharge meant that, okay, you've done something that basically was very bad in the military, and as a result, you basically lose access to your benefits. The other than honorable discharge at the time could range from like a medical discharge, or saying, okay, like you was in the service and you wasn't really bad, but you wasn't really good either, so we're just gonna go ahead and kind of get you out of the service. And that was pretty much the general type of discharges. That was an easy way to kind of lock people out, because when we look at it, they say, okay, they tended to be disproportionately given out to Black soldiers. Now, I don't know the actual percentages that they were given out, but when they mentioned something like the blue discharge, they initially mentioned, because I don't even know about the blue discharge in the first place, is because I want to say it was a few years back, they started talking about that for LGBTQ veterans who were in the 1950s and 1960s, who were either discovered and stuff like that, and they were given a blue discharge. But when people started doing more research, like, oh, this actually can be traced back to Black veterans, like not only from World War II, but I think as far back as even possibly World War I. But again, I wouldn't quote me on that one. But normally, at least from my understanding up to this point, that the initial idea was that as long as you got an honorable discharge, you were supposed to be entitled to a GI Bill. With that being stated, again, it depended on what part of the country you were in, and what part of the country, what areas you were in terms of how much you could use of that bill. So like if you was in the deep South, or you was in certain parts of the Midwest or the Northeast, and you say, okay, I got a GI Bill, got a low interest home, I'm gonna go buy a home over here. Well, if that area is redlined, you only restrict to the redlined area, which means depreciate assets and stuff. Same thing in the South. It's like, okay, you got a GI Bill, but what school can you go to use it? Well, again, if the HBCU like Houston Tillotson or another school is taking it, then you may be able to get an education. But if there's a school that's not willing to take it, then you're SOL. And then same thing with home ownership and stuff like that, because that's why when they started reevaluating kind of the significance of redlining and depreciating assets and wealth, some people was going as far to connect it back to the GI Bill, because they said, okay, well, with the GI Bill, if you're only restricted to certain areas that have depreciating assets, then it kind of works counterintuitive. So.
Thank you, Cale. There's a couple of comments about Flipper in the chat. Alice is asking, were all of his assignments after West Point with the Buffalo Soldiers?
As far as I know, yes. So pretty much once he was graduates from West Point, he's automatic. I can't remember which regiment he's assigned to. I know someone else. I know someone out there's gonna probably call me out on this. So I apologize, and honestly, I'll let y'all take that one. But he was pretty much assigned to basically the Black Cavalry regiments, and pretty much when he was at Fort Davis, he was a commissary officer. And during that point, he actually had a friendship with one of the white officers that was there. But then while he's in charge of the commissary, there's an accusation that he was taking either supplies or money, and that stuff wasn't turning up, and that the books weren't right. And he was accused of it, and then basically his commission was taken away and everything else. So like while he's the first, his career in the military arguably was the shortest. And as a result, I think it wasn't until like years later where they went back and reviewed the case and they said, okay, well, we restore his commission and then give him an honorable discharge, because they looked at because initially said he was basically given trumped up charges and then booted from the military. Now, with that being stated, before he did left, he did have some last emphasis on it, something called a flipper ditch, basically where it came to a drainage system on the post on the western frontier. So he did do some good things, but in terms of when it comes to his service, he was attached to Buffalo Soldier regiments. Like a lot of the black graduates from West Point early on, like John Alexander, for example, he was attached to the Buffalo Soldier regiments until he was sent to Wilberforce to act as an ROTC to help build their ROTC program. The same thing with Charles Young. So pretty much the first 3 black graduates from West Point, they were pretty much assigned to the Buffalo Soldiers. Now, when you get to Benjamin O. Davis Jr. and the black graduates after, which is in the 1930s and 1940s, they start getting sent to other units by that point. Because of course, O. Davis Jr., he goes Army Air Corps or Army Air Forces, and then the other ones, I think they go infantry and a few other units and stuff. So,
Alice, I see you came off mute. Feel free to jump in.
I just wanted to mention that Flipper was, I mean, like you said, Cale, it was a setup when he was commissary officer, but I think it was brought on by the fact that he went horseback riding with a young white daughter of one of the officers, and people around didn't approve of that. And so they tried to dishonor him as much as they could. And which really, it's shameful. It's just a part of our history because I grew up in West Texas, and I've kind of always been partial to that area. But after reading that, I'm just sad, because there was that much racism. Can I call it racism? During the 1800s.
Cale, I'll let you respond.
Oh yeah, she pretty much got it on point. And I'm glad that you brought that up, because I remember hearing that a lot too when I was younger. And I think I ended up forgetting about it sadly, but I remember hearing about that a lot when I was younger, talking about the story about him going horseback riding with one of the officer's young daughters, and then saying, okay, we got to get rid of him, because that kind of honestly ends up being one of the triggers, shall we say, to a lot of incidences involving not only black military personnel, but even some of the more destructive events that we know in history. In the case of, I forgot the name, but it was this major incident that occurred in Tennessee in the 1890s, where it was a successful black businessman that was accused of having an affair with a white woman, and they literally burned down they killed him, and they burned down his business. So that ends up, it's kind of a common theme that shows up, but that goes into another stuff that goes beyond Buffalo Soldiers that
Yeah.
I may not be able to talk to. But I'm glad that you brought that up. Thank you, man.
Thank you, Alice. We are at 7:15, but I think we just have one or two questions left. And thank you, Cale, for hanging in through all of these questions. It's much appreciated. Sean has a question. He says, in the Pacific Theater, there were some units identified as gunboats incorporated under battleship units. They seemingly were poorly documented, mostly USMC units. During your research, Mr. Carter, have you ever come across any references to these units?
So in terms of gunboats, so far the most research I came across was and this is something I'm still trying to research myself, was motor torpedo boat squadrons. Now, the fact that he's mentioning gunboats and mentioning U.S. Marine Corps, that may be an entirely different subsection that needs to be more researched. But the reason why I bring up the torpedo boat squadrons is because one of the things that I came across, like when I was ironically researching a difference of like the mess attendants and stewards in the Navy during the war, was that, and it was a photo I came across, and I still to this day I'm trying to figure out like basically where's the source of it and everything else. But it's a photo of these guys who are part of a motor torpedo boat squadron, and apparently they're listed as commandos, and it's a group of white guys. They're all having Japanese flags, captured weapons, and one of the guys in the center is a black sailor, and like he's wearing the frogs. He's wearing the I don't know if that was marine camo or frog skin camo or what, but like they're all wearing camouflage, and they apparently all basically, in addition to doing the motor torpedo boats, they would actually go in and do like basically raids on some of these small Japanese islands. And apparently, at least from some of the documentation in terms of photos, some black sailors here or there that was mess attendants on those boats or cooks did participate. But as for like clear information to say, hey, sailor so and so, well, mess attendant, like all like stewards so and so participated in this, I haven't came across any at this moment.
Thank you, Cale. Well, on that note, are there any final questions? Would anybody like to come off mute and say anything or ask a question? We did have a question from an audience member asking about the other audience member who's wearing the hat. And I don't know if that audience member feels comfortable saying hello, but there was a question about it.
Well, my name is First Sergeant Clinton Warren of the Texas Buffalo Soldier Association. And I'm sitting up here enjoying myself tonight. You did a great job. I just want to add one thing for the audience to let you guys know real quick. You can Google this form I'm getting ready to give you. This form is called SF 180, Sierra Foxtrot 180. And if you submit this form, the United States government will issue all military records, awards, and everything for your veteran and your family. And it's totally free. You don't have to pay anything, but give them a little time because it's only two women that run this department, and they will issue everything. You'll be surprised sometime what you get back.
That's incredible. Thank you so much for coming off mute and letting us know about that. Any other final closing comments or questions for Mr. Carter? All right. Well, this has been an absolute honor, Mr. Carter, and I hope before you leave tonight's Zoom, you have a chance to scroll through the comments, because I probably did a poor job of conveying just how much people appreciated hearing this presentation. So take a tour through that, because certainly this was important, and we're so glad to have had you here tonight. Well, this concludes tonight's presentation. We hope that you will join us again for a future presentation. We have them once a month, all the months of the year except January. As we move into the holiday season, we'll be featuring Texas State Historic Sites some of the Texas Historical Commission's 38 historic sites. We'll have a couple of those. So we invite you to get to know our state historic sites. And as I mentioned before, please keep an eye on your email for my follow-up tomorrow with a link to a recording of this event, as well as some of the resources that Cale has mentioned in his presentation. And if there's any other questions I can answer for you, please feel free to email me. My name is Christy, and I'm with the Friends of the Texas Historical Commission. I will put my email address into the chat. Thank you all and have a wonderful night.
Thank you. Let's see. Like, do I log off or?
I'm about to end it for all of us.
All right. Well, thanks again. Just keep me in the loop if there's another plan talk. Nice seeing you, First Sergeant, too, guys. This is the first time I actually seen him because I've talked on the phone with him a few times and stuff. This is the first time I actually seen him. Well, apart from that documentary, and I was sitting there like, why did he put you into the last 2 minutes?
You guys need to connect.
Hopefully we'll connect in the near future. Hopefully.
Definitely. It has to happen. All right, everyone. Thank you so much, Cale. Thank you. I will circle back with you privately tomorrow, but just know how much we appreciated this tonight. See you all at the next virtual event.